No, do you want us to? Actually,
We do have microphones available.
Do you want us to have
would that
mics?
be better? Maybe?
My voice doesn't particularly carry, so.
Okay, we'll do like whatever you wish.
Can people hear okay? I mean,
I'm fine.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Denise?
we can if we want to. Yeah, whatever.
That makes it easier. Does that make it easier for recording, perhaps?
If you want to, sure.
Yeah.
No.
No, we were debating one way or the other.
Totally reasonable, and then click on.
Then I don't feel like I get nervous when I have to project because I have this little voice and now I don't have to be nervous about that.
Yeah, you don't. Cool. So just before we get started, thanks everyone for coming.
Hey.
The hope is this is just a really informal space to bat around ideas with some amazing folks who volunteered their time, and we're so grateful they're here. Consciousness Hacking is a group that was started out of the Media Lab maybe 10 years ago. There's about 10,000 people in it now around the globe, and generally interested in relationships between technology and well-being. Interested in different ways of measuring, whether measuring is the point, different ways of augmenting awareness and introspection, and often introspecting on sort of the intersections of spirituality and science. So our last two events, we had one on sleep, which talked a little bit about sleep and memory, a little bit about circadian rhythms, a little bit about dreams, a little bit about PTSD and trauma in sleep. Then we had an event on meditation and neuroscience, which was some folks who specialize on sort of sensors and awareness in the body, some folks who focus more on brain imaging through EEG and fMRI, and then some professors just of clinical practice at the Divinity School. So try to mix different perspectives, and tonight we have some folks who are going to help us think a lot about ways we define health, ways we define relationships, ways we relate to each other, ways we relate to ourselves. And just really quickly, so we have a sense of who's hanging out with us. So Professor Ert Waldinger is a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and Zen priest. He's a professor at HMS at Harvard Medical School, and he's the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which, as somebody from Psych and Neuro, I think is incredibly cool. It's a 75-year-long study.
It's going to be 80.
It's an 80-year-long study,
Yeah.
which makes it one of the longest scientific investigations into human life.
I did not start the study.
Yeah.
You look great.
Which gives, I think, Professor Waldinger sort of special leave to talk about long-term health, about relationships, about longevity, which is really wonderful. Also, Professor Waldinger gave a TED Talk, which a lot of you might have seen, which is focused on relationships, which was talked about, I think, a lot about happiness and how to get happier. I think he's going to touch on that a little bit tonight, maybe complicate that, maybe add on to it. And is going to talk about what relationships tie us together, which keep us individually healthy, what makes a good life. And then Linda Stone here is a thought leader who is focusing on our relationships to tech, how tech can impair or evolve relationships to ourselves. So she has served in leadership roles early in Microsoft and Apple, pioneered social media and multimedia tech, and stayed in the technology space ever since, and is part of the TED Catalyst Advisory Board and the MIT Media Lab Advisory Board. Linda has explored since early days of tech, sort of impact of technology on our attention. So she coined two terms which you might be familiar with, which are continuous partial attention, screen apnea, 3 terms, and email apnea, and is now thinking a lot about expounding on that relationship to ourselves through technology, and thinking a lot about essential self-technology, which is a wise body supported by helpful technology, thinking a lot about wisdom of the body, wisdom of the brain, integrating the two, not prioritizing one over the other, perhaps. And yeah, so we're going to dive into all those questions, health and relationships, and informal talking space. We'll listen for a bit, and then we'll pass it back out to the audience. And thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, guys. And I'm Katie Resendiz. I am one of the co-organizers of Consciousness Hacking. And my background is in design, primarily, but through sort of curiosity about innate natural abilities of this human machine that we occupy, as well as some experiences with physical trauma. I've explored a lot of different modalities, whether it's religious, contemplative practice, kind of looking for answers in a common vernacular about some of the ways we talk about wellness, well-being, contemplative matters. And so that's kind of the spirit of this group, is creating an open dialogue, having people from all different disciplines, whether you're a technologist or a practitioner, kind of come together and exchange stories, because I think at the end of the day, we're all trying to connect. The way we define that might be a little bit different, but the more we share with each other, I think the more interesting things we discover. And so I'm very excited to be with my old friend Robert and my new friend Linda. And I think to have you guys kind of start off, that was a lovely introduction, but maybe in your own words, share a little bit. Robert, we'll start with you because you're right here. A little bit about your practice as a Zen priest. That was one thing I don't know that you mentioned. And I know Robert from his TED Talk, and I learned about him as the director of the study, and I sort of had that definition of him, and sort of at the end of that experience, it was a footnote that, oh yes, and by the way, I'm going on a Zen retreat right after this. It's like, hey, we should talk about that. So share a little bit about your background.
And by the way, Katie designed the images for my TED Talk, and without that, it would have been a mess. She's really talented. So yeah, I mean, it's a kind of odd combination of it, being a psychiatrist and being an adult developmental researcher and being a Zen person. I've just mostly started practicing Zen about 12 years ago and have just found it more and more absorbing and more helpful in that it's a different window on being human than either being a psychiatrist or studying humans in a research mode. And it's really the window on being human from sitting on a cushion and simply watching your life as it comes up. So I sit in meditation every day, and I sit with a group on Monday nights in Newton Center, and I've gotten more involved in teaching and go to retreats. Retreats have been really helpful. They're just several day-long periods where it's intensive meditation, and it's added a huge dimension to my life that I did not expect. I was not a kind of spiritual person, and actually I was really involved in Zen, and then somebody said it was a spiritual practice, and I said, what? No. Because it just wasn't who I was. But it's been a huge addition to my life. Also to my work, but that's not primarily why I do it.
And how, so I'm thinking of the timeline, so you've been a practicing psychiatrist for many years, sort of did pressures from that area, or did something, a personal experience kind of lead you to seek out Zen as a practice? And then I'm curious, which informed the other? Does Zen sort of inform your work professionally, or did your professional experience kind of lead you to a Zen practice?
Actually, I began to realize that like a lot of what I worried about most of the time was pretty stupid, and didn't amount to anything, and I sort of got this. I began to get it as a teenager, but I kept watching myself worrying about all these things that when you think about sort of life and death and how short life is, most of the stuff that I think about is of no consequence, and yet I get really worried about it. And that was kind of this disconnect for me. And I noticed that everybody else was doing it too, right? And I kept imagining I was the only one who, I had the most stupid thoughts and the most stupid preoccupations, but I realized that, everybody was doing this, and I kept wondering why, and so, and then Buddhist sort of psychology, theology was an explanatory system that kind of helped me put some of it into perspective, and then practicing really made a difference. And then what I realized was that I had had some early experiences that you usually have in meditation, and I had them as a kid and didn't know what they were. And that seems to happen. There are a lot of people who come to meditation who had experiences that they kind of pushed away because they were weird and they didn't know what they were. And so that was mine. And so I think it's probably not an accident that I kept drifting toward a meditative practice.
And so I'm going to shift it over to Linda just to respond to some of that and also give us a little bit about your background, because it's also started this multidisciplinary, meandering path that all kind of informs your research and profession now.
Yeah, so if you're not on a straight and narrow goal-oriented path, don't worry about it, it all works out, especially if you're following your passions and things that are meaningful to you. So I don't usually mention this, but it was an interesting note to Katie that I did my graduate work in education and actually started out as an educator and then a children's librarian, and also taught pre-service and in-service teachers, and got involved with technology very early on. In fact, my first interaction with the Media Lab was in 1984 at their logo conference. So I was always fascinated by technology, but I was interested in technology that didn't take over, and that has stayed a theme with me, and I'll get to that in a second. I was in a crippling car accident in the early 1980s and lost the use of my right leg for several years, and the person that I was dating, Charlie, and I know you've got this song, Did He Ever Return? No, he never returned. But I was dating Charlie. We were supposed to go cross-country skiing, and I had to have my knee elevated 16 hours a day above my heart. So Charlie brought me a 4K computer, that dates me a little bit, right? Top of the line, with a book on basic, and went skiing, and no, he never returned. But I was hooked, and that led me further and deeper into technology. And as an educator, I was most interested in learning about how kids learn by watching them with logo. And then ultimately, through innovative education grants that I wrote when I was an educator, I was recruited to work at Apple Computer in 1986. And I went to Apple and ultimately pioneered multimedia at Apple. It started when it was green and amber screen, and then helped with everything from bringing video and audio in, worked with those engineers to HyperCard, built the HyperCard and multimedia developer communities, was very involved in all of that, and then ultimately worked for Scully when he was CEO, and began the work with the publishing community to move toward information products. From there, I was recruited to Microsoft, actually by Nathan Myhrvold when he was running research, and this was in the early 90s. And I was in the process of getting divorced and was still, my ex and I were still very good friends, so I thought I needed to leave the state so that we could actually stay divorced and move on with our lives. So I decided to head back to Seattle, where I had done my undergraduate and graduate work, took a job at Microsoft and in Microsoft research, and then did a pitch that I wanted in late 93, early 94, that I wanted to start a research group that focused on online social life and virtual community. And you can imagine pitching something like that to Bill Gates. So I said, this isn't for people like you who have no social life and don't care about a social life, which at that time really was true. Now it's less true. But I said, it's for everybody else in the world, because the language that they did understand was that telephony was a much bigger market than cable. So when I said, here are the numbers in cable, here are the numbers in telephony, what do you think people are going to want to do with this technology? They're going to want to talk to each other. So, and in that role in research, when I got funded to do that group, I was able to bring in social scientists, and I brought in UI people that I'd known from Apple and whatnot. And we were able to do some really interesting work that was, that ultimately, you guys probably don't know VChat, Comic Chat, and a number of other technologies that turned out to to be interesting and insightful early multi-user PowerPoint proof of concept technologies. And then after a number of years in research, I was recruited by Steve Ballmer to work with him on just the larger climate that Microsoft was dealing with around the antitrust case. I was one of the few people at a senior level who was respected, but also, you know, had been in the Valley, had been in Seattle, had all the relationships, and so that was also an interesting job. In my last years in Microsoft research, and also on the side when I was working for Ballmer when he was CEO, I had gotten really interested in the psychophysiology of our relationship to technology, and in 1997 coined the phrase continuous partial attention, because everybody was talking about multitasking, and they weren't actually doing simple multitasking. They were doing something that was so much scarier. They were doing complex multitasking, but because they always dropped the simple or the complex, I thought we needed another term. And so I talked about continuous partial attention, which is continuously giving everything partial attention. And how many of you experience that from friends, loved ones, and even in yourself? And then I thought, okay, you know, people started to ask me, can you tell us how to get our attention back? And of course, when you read about how you get your attention back, it's pay attention. And I was like, well, that isn't actually going to work, because there's already this high anxiety fight or flight thing happening when you're working with technology. And then I started to connect to, oh my gosh, people are like this, or they're like this, and they're not breathing. And breathing is one of the things that gives us our body back and gives us our attention back. And so so I ultimately coined another phrase, email apnea, screen apnea, and started to talk about how attention was a full body sport. It wasn't only in the mind. And as I explained to Katie after I left Microsoft, I both lost my home and most of the things in it in a fire, and was diagnosed with a bone infection. So boy, did I ever get to practice breathing, among other things. But that led me even a little further, because as a technology person, I was living in a quantified world with engineers. And now I was at a point where things weren't binary. It wasn't, are you happy, are you not happy? It was, how happy are you in this moment? And you better discover how happy you are and build on that, because that's your best plan for feeling better. So I also got very interested in, wow, we are setting up consumer health technologies with this model of giving our agency away to technology that we supposedly build the brains in, that then dictates to a cognitive mind, that then tyrannizes an innocent body, when all the wisdom is in the body. And what we really need to do is find our wise body, and helpful technology can support that. So for me, it's all about agency. And I spoke for way too long, sorry.
It's fascinating. You cruised right through my bullet points, so you're like doing my job for me. I love it.
But one of the things that strikes me, there's a lot of threads to pull there, but I want to come back to Robert and talking about the study a little bit, because I think figuring out how we quantify wellness, how we quantify happiness, when we talk about whether or not that's the right word, is interesting. And so tell us a little bit about the study that you're working on now and how that kind of factors into what we're talking about.
Sure. The study isn't a study of happiness. The TED organization took the talk and billed it as that, because apparently people watch talks that have happiness in their title. But the study is about lifespan development. It's really, it was radical back in 1938 when it started, which was basically there had been so much emphasis on what was wrong, on psychopathology, on physical pathology, and so both studies wanted to study, both a study of juvenile delinquents in Boston and a study of Harvard College sophomores, wanted to study how people developed into young adults who thrived, And so it's really been a study of well-being and thriving. And people didn't expect it to continue beyond, say, 10 years, and so now it's been 80 years. But it's really always been about the conditions of thriving. And so that broad umbrella of well-being, and it's useful to talk about that just a little bit because, you know, we have this happiness, the commodification of happiness, if you will. And there, you go to the self-help section of any bookstore now, if you still go to a bookstore, or to go to Amazon, and it's just filled with how to be happy. And it's all about fixes that have to do with increasing your level of current happiness. And really, the only problem with that, I mean, we can do that. There are methods that have been shown to increase our levels, our moods at any given moment. But really, it can sell the idea that we could all be happy all the time if we wanted to. And if you're not happy on a given day, then what's wrong with you? And you're obviously not doing the right stuff. And human life just isn't like that. I mean, we all know it. We don't want to admit it to ourselves, but it's not like that. So I just sort of, sorry, it's a bit of a soapbox, but it's really important to talk about, for me to talk about thriving and well-being, and not happiness per se. Happiness is a transient state.
And so tell us a little bit about, for those of you who haven't seen the talk, is you speak about relationships. And
Yeah.
I'm curious to, when you talk about how you're measuring longevity or thriving or wellness, is it interviews, is it biofeedback? What are some of the ways that you quantify those things, and what is it that you're quantifying?
So we started just studying the big domains of life, work and relationships and physical health and mental health. And it was initially questionnaires and the occasional interview. And every 2 years we would ask people to fill out questionnaires. When I came into the study in 2003, people had never even been audio taped. So we started videotaping them, talking with their wives about their biggest concerns, and we went to their homes and drew their blood and did complex neuropsychological testing on them and tried to wed this to all the things we knew about what they cared the most about in life, how often they volunteered in their community, did they go to church or not, did they believe in God, what was their greatest source of satisfaction in life. And we heard about all that, and we got all these biological measures as well. And so then now you don't have to watch the TED Talk, because I'm going to give you the take homes, which is that when we looked at all the things that predicted who was going to age well and who was not, that the biological parameters weren't such good predictors. So how well your blood glucose was in control in middle age didn't predict what kind of an octogenarian you were going to be. It was literally how satisfied you were with your relationships. And we kept thinking, and we actually thought that this was noise, not signal coming from our data. But how can this be? And because most of us have for a long time imagined that the mind and body are pretty separate. And it wasn't really until the late 1980s when a bunch of different research groups came up with the same findings, which is that the quality of people's human interactions was a powerful predictor of their health, physical health. Not just, it wouldn't be a surprise that if you had good relationships, you might be happier. But then it makes you get diabetes less soon or not at all, that it diminishes your chances of heart disease in middle age and later. How could that be? So now we're studying the children. Almost all the original men have died, and the few who are living are in their mid to late 90s. But their kids are all baby boomers. So we're now funded by the National Institute on Aging to study their children. And we're doing everything from asking them about their most traumatic experience to their fondest memory of their parents, to drawing blood for C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 and doing DNA methylation studies for different patterns of stress responsivity, and you can get cortisol from your hair. We found all these cool ways to measure kind of chronic levels of stress. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to, it's hard to do, we're trying to meld biological data with psychological, social data. And we even know, like, we know who their parents voted for in every presidential election. And we're looking at that in relation to all kinds of things. My predecessor, George Downey, claims to have found that liberals have sex longer during their lives than conservatives. I think he's just making up the data. but there are all these things that we can look at that are really unusual because we asked such a broad range of questions about so many things about life.
So that's interesting. So even though you guys are kind of coming at this question of technology and quantifying this very sort of intangible thing from different angles, there's some similar conclusions that what we can measure is not necessarily the most instructive.
Or what we're focused on measuring, because, you know, all your, even your self-reported studies, that's a kind of measurement in and of itself. But what we're focused on measuring isn't necessarily that meaningful, and then what we're focused on intervening with isn't necessarily that meaningful. I would rather have someone, the woman that mentioned resilience earlier, I would, if I were working with those adolescents, one of the things that I would want to do is give them a set of images to choose from and ask them to tell me how each image made them feel. And then I would want to take the images that made them feel happier or better, and I would want them to have those images available, rotating on a phone or on an iPad or something else. So it's a way of getting something that self-reports, that hooks into an overall feeling, and that they can then easily access, and that makes them feel empowered. And they've used their sense of agency at the beginning and all the way through. So
it's like a collaboration. It's not prescriptive and prescriptive alone.
It's not someone else deciding, this is cute, you're going to love it. I'm shoving it at you. Right, you get to pick.
I'm really, and I know you're really interested in this too, Linda, I'm interested in how technology is shaping our consciousness as well as our bodies. But, you know, I was having dinner with my son, who's an MIT grad student, just before this, and I was saying, you know, that I was sure that there were aspects of human interaction that would never be replaceable by technology, and he said, how do you know that? And of course I don't know that. And I'm a big Battlestar Galactica fan, and I think that
What about Black Mirror?
I didn't see Black Mirror.
Yeah.
But
I think that's the first episode of Black Mirror.
for us it raises these questions of kind of like, and my department chair sent me a blog post the other day saying it's going to be hard to train Siri to be a psychotherapist. And the question is there, a really important question for me is, are there things about the experience we have with other human beings that is simply not quantifiable, that the totality of it could never be measured, and that it has effects that simply can't be replicated with technology?
Yes, and we talked about Steve Porges the other day. So Stephen Porges is one of my inspirations. He's a wonderful neuroscientist, based sort of part-time at UNC Chapel Hill and part-time now in Bloomington, Indiana at the Kinsey Institute. And his wife Sue was one of the early neuroscientists working on oxytocin, and they're incredible people. Anyway, one of the things that Steve's been studying for many years is quality of voice, prosody of voice, and rhythm. So we might never be able to train Siri to be a psychotherapist, but we could give Siri a really comforting voice. And we could have Siri speak in this comforting voice. Steve's developed some technology that can be used to analyze, if you're doing telephone support, to analyze the voices of people doing phone support to determine when they're stressed and they need a break. And then voice technology to also help them learn to speak in this voice that would be more soothing. So there are all these interesting things that we can do with who we are as human beings and supporting who we can be at our best as human beings.
And I think you guys raised an interesting point where, you know, the collaboration between the technology, how you mentioned the wise body, the helpful technology, is really interesting because you do bring up these technologies, these particularly around predictive analytics and things like this that can measure and prescribe a condition. Voice technology that recognizes that someone's behavior has changed or their voice has changed or they sound depressed, and then can sort of create a pathway where a human can then intervene and offer some of these person-to-person therapies that work in a different way, but that maybe there's this balance where the two work together to have a better result than either could alone.
Yeah, I think of another example. You know, couples, one of the things they find, particularly for men, is that some men are completely out of touch with their levels of emotional arousal, so that they'll be having an argument with their partner, and they'll be all aroused and they won't know it, but they withdraw from the interaction, and then the partner is left saying, but wait, we're talking about this, and then some of these people, often men, will lash out, even violently, physically. And one idea is that many of these people are really out of touch with their level of arousal, but that the level of arousal is aversive, so they pull away. And one idea is to use technology to help them know, to use all kinds of training, to help them know when they're more aroused and what that means, rather than having it all operate outside of awareness and drive them to things that they then regret later.
So I'll give you an example. A couple that I know, this was before they got married, now they're very happily married, but and they're both in the psychology space. He would become aroused and angry, sometimes about things that she considered to be pretty minor, but he would really lash out at her. She started recording, and then he would deny that he ever had. I never said that, I never did that.
I never raised my voice. Right?
So she started recording him on her iPhone when he would be lashing out, and then when they would, after they were both calmer, when they would discuss what had happened, she would say, here's what happened. Do you hear your tone of voice? And it's over, it doesn't happen anymore. It's really interesting. So, yeah,
so
not suggesting that you try that.
Yeah, don't try to.
Why not?
Because unintended consequences, I don't know. I don't know who you're married to.
Well, but we are there, though, in that people are being recorded in situations where they're not aware they're being recorded, or they have the opportunity to review their behavior when they did not know they were being recorded, which is consequently going to open this thinking process for all of us.
So Santa's always going to know if you've been naughty or nice. There's no getting around it.
But you can't possibly know your presentation to others, right? You can only know your presentation from your perspective outwardly. So seeing yourself in an interaction, particularly in a heightened emotional state, actually teaches you a lot about yourself that you cannot otherwise recognize. You don't have access to. I think that's going to be tremendously powerful in changing our relationships.
Okay, so
that's something that's accessible in technology today. And I mean, we see it, where do we see it right now? We see it right now with the police cameras. Right?
That came to mind.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all, as a society, having to deal with, what does it look like from the police perspective? Now, you get to be the policeman and see how quickly you have to respond to very limited inputs and a very confusing, chaotic situation. And you have to make an assessment a performance assessment at that moment. So I think I think the technology is going to push us in that direction much faster than we realize. And that this self-review, or this reviewing, the ability to review our relationships that count, right, the ones that are the strongest and have the most conflict in them, is actually going to make them healthier. Because you're not going to have this confusion of my perspective, your perspective, and no third-party observation.
Yes.
There's one interesting anecdote that comes to mind when you're talking about body cameras. When you first started to speak, the first thing that came to mind was a couple months ago, a video came out of an altercation between a black female driver and a white police officer. I'm going to get the details of the case wrong, but kind of both sides of the argument pointed at it and said, see, I kept my cool, I used my training, and from my perspective, I sort of saw someone who was visibly agitated, who sounded like he was picking a fight, and it's interesting to me to think about there's a way to measure that interaction and then watch it back, but there's also still a perception of the people watching of how they behave. And it's not necessarily always measured on the same scale, where you can look back and say, no, I acted totally reasonably. No, I acted totally reasonably.
You know, I'm interested in this because I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a psychoanalyst, and one of the theories about how we learn who we are as children is that we learn who we are through relationships. We learn who we are through having ourselves and aspects of ourselves reflected back. And in a way, this is metaphorically. I mean, you know, our parents aren't videotaping us and then showing, although they do that too. But really more that, you know, we our friends, everybody we encounter reflects back to us aspects of how we are with them, and that's a big part of how we form a sense of who we are. And what's interesting is this idea that maybe technology takes it to a finer point. Where we get to look in a different way at who we are, not as metabolized through some other person reflecting it back to us, but just the videotape.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's already happened, right? I mean, anyone who uses technology more than
we just need to give video cameras to everybody else so they can video the police officers. So
well, but I mean, the dialogue that you have with yourself now has already changed in many ways in terms of the things that are available to objectively measure your behavior.
Right.
What are you thinking of?
I'm just curious, the sort of personal perspective versus review perspective is, I have a lot of questions about what you can measure looking back on a situation versus all the different things you feel in terms of matched body cues or perhaps breath or perhaps eye contact that will be possibly hard with computer vision or machine learning to pick up. Questions about how much of that really is measurable from a scientific perspective, the sort of intuition in a relationship, from the technological perspective in terms of what you can pick up and then reflect on from a third party, how much of that is going to remain mysterious because it's just not a numbers question, if that makes sense.
I can give an example, but I hope this is on point. It's been really difficult to reliably code emotions. So you watch a videotape of someone talking or a couple having a discussion, and you want to know how angry is this person.
Yeah.
And so how do you get two people to watch the same videotape and say this person is a 7 out of 10, and everybody to agree. And so John Gottman, who's a researcher out in University of Washington, developed this elaborate coding system with, a rule manual this big, and getting reliability was almost impossible. It turns out no one else could use it, that it was really difficult to write a set of rules for recognizing emotion. So what we tried, and other people have tried it too, not just us, is just getting people to use their gut instincts. We get a bunch of undergraduates to sit in a room and watch a tape and say, how angry is that guy? Rate him. And any one person's rating was not reliable. But when you crowdsourced it, you could get a hugely reliable pooled index of somebody's emotion expression, how it was coming across. And so there's some, I don't know if that spoke to what you were saying.
It totally does. It totally does, yeah.
I think the other question I just want you guys to address before we jump to some more audience question is, we're sort of orbiting around this thought of how reliable of a lens is this technology. So, for instance, social media, how many stories have we heard about people are projecting a false, more sort of successful, happy version of themselves online, which is really in turn just making us all feel worse about ourselves because we're only seeing a tiny porthole into that person's life. Or when you say that relationships are the key to sort of longevity, what does that mean if a lot of our relationships are predominantly online?
Right.
How do you guys both react to
Do you
those
know?
things?
I have hunches. I have hunches, but I'm sure a lot of you have hunches also. I mean, one of the things that I see and have written a little bit about is mothers who are texting while they're breastfeeding instead of having eye contact, and the importance of eye contact in terms of developing empathy. Did you all gasp in horror?
Yeah.
You know how common that is?
It's really common.
It's really common. And eye contact is what makes us feel safe in the world. So one of the things that I'm also really interested in is how do we develop technology that both supports our sense of agency and our feeling of safety. And again, this gets back to resilience and back to some of the things that were touched upon right before we started. And I frankly don't feel that safe when my phone is telling me that I didn't walk enough steps even though I just had 3 hours of dental work. That is not about safety or anything good.
My watch just told me it's time to stand up.
I'm going to respect you.
10 minutes before the end.
I'm going to still.
Yeah, you guys want to have a little stand?
No, it really did, but it's
Yeah.
like ridiculous.
It really did.
The
So,
sitting was telling us to.
yeah. So, did you want to interrupt with the question?
Well, I just wanted to ask a question because, like, I find your research really fascinating. So I guess my question is, because I was the one who asked about resilience and whether there's set points and whether it can be developed. So let's take that breastfeeding woman and say she's not doing eye contact, so the child gets insecure attachment style, like one of the 3. So I guess the question is, like, that child's set point is a little bit less. Can she use or employ some of the exercises you said, like with the cell phone for the adolescents to kind of, you know, bulk up and kind of, can you use neuroplasticity or like training to increase one's resilience and subsidize for
I think you can increase.
last, you
I
know,
think
like
you
a
can
gap?
increase one's feeling of safety, and I think it can happen in multiple ways. Obviously, without technology, but with human contact, but also with technology. Are you familiar with the research of Pat Poole and Andy Meltzoff?
No.
At University of Washington, they have something called iLab there, and they have gesturing robots and non-gesturing robots, and it turns out that kids respond really well to the gesturing robots. They treat the gesturing robots as if they're willing to engage a little more. But I think that this is all really ripe for experimentation, and I think the areas that I would look to for experimentation would be images, which can be very emotionally evocative, music, which is very emotionally evocative, voice and quality of voice, and I would encourage you to look at Steve Porges's work, and he has a new product out called SSP, standing for Safe and Sound Protocol from Integrated Listening Systems, and it helps retrain the ear so that the ear is more sensitive to soothing sounds of human connection versus the sounds that trigger fight or flight, the lower frequency sounds. So those are some of the interesting things that are out there. And again, the thing that I'm most concerned about, I don't know how many of you are developers or engineers, is that we really consider sense of agency, and we really consider how important that is in our developing and evolving relationship with technology, because technology is always going to be with us. And when you were talking about your son's question about technology being the mediator, one of the things that I was talking to Katie about a little earlier, maybe it was to you, was when we people who are, I'm in my 60s, when we used to talk on the phone would be there, and then our imagination would listen, we'd listen to the voice and we would imagine the person. And now, when we talk on the phone, we're relating to the phone. And the person is there and we hear their voice, but it isn't like we're imagining this co-presence in the way that we used to do. And it could be that we're on the phone and we're playing words with friends while we're talking to them, or we're making a note, or they don't know what we're doing. If you're doing FaceTime, maybe you're a little bit more connected, but when you're just holding a phone that's this dumb, nothing thing between you, then you get to realistic, looking at the image, versus believable, imagining and having all those emotions, imagining the love that you have for the person or how furious you are with them or whatever it is, versus having the device at the center with the device as the hub and we're all spokes off the hub. That's how we're treating technology today, is that it has that place in our lives. So that's the thing to question as we start developing new technologies for health or for anything, is what are the sort of litmus tests? Where's agency? Over there or over here? Those are some of the kinds of things.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Like, I agree with you, and I feel like the technology today is not designed for well-being or human flourishing. It's designed with a different purpose. Also, people are not willing to pay because they're so used to a model where there's free software. So what do you think is required to sort of shift the model back to, what kind of model is required where the design of technology is focused on flourishing as compared to you spend 53 minutes on Facebook, and if we can just get you to spend 65 minutes, that's 3 more clicks.
So I think there's an interesting question there about like the currency of attention and how we're sort of spending our attention.
And the broader, like, apart from the technology, the broader ecosystem that supports that kind of design of technology, that I don't think we would have come so far if there wasn't an economic model to support that much design of technology in that way.
One of the things I think we don't focus enough on is, what is the goal of all this? Like, what exactly, like whenever you design something, what do you want to make happen in the world, right? So you could just your goal could just be see some images and feel better. Your goal could be make a riveting video game that will keep this kid in his basement for the next 10 years, right? It could be, because it's really...
Leave the room if that's good.
Yeah. But, so one of the things that I'm interested in is the difference between technology that actually gets people to truly connect with each other, because relationships are kind of main focus for me. So for me, the question is, does technology actually lead people to make more connections, more actual in-the-world connections? Or does it create a more solipsistic me and the device universe? And for me, that solipsism is scary, because I think it doesn't lead to thriving. But my son just said, well, why not? Why isn't it okay just play World of Warcraft forever? So I'm old-fashioned.
And is there a social aspect to playing that game that's sort of like a new relationship, and just a new form of relationship that maybe doesn't fit your framework but fits his framework?
Right, exactly. And so I'm a fuddy-duddy, and I say, wait, there's something about the in-person, real-time connection that's vital, that's unique, that really contributes to well-being. And he's saying, how do you know that?
Are you going to look at it in your study?
Huh?
Are you going to look at it in
We
your
are
study?
we're going to start, if we can get the funding to study the 3rd and the 4th generations, we're going to start studying technology.
That's great.
Awesome.
That's great.
Can
Can we go back to your question about human flourishing for a minute? Do you mind
Yeah,
doing that?
that was one thing I was going to pick up, is I think there's some interest too about the body as a technology, and I think we're sort of gleaning over what is innately powerful about the body. And I'd love for you to address
Well,
some
so
of that.
you were asking about human flourishing, and there are all of these applications that have come out, like Happify and all this stuff. And I, you know, as a person who serves as an advisor here and there with VCs or whatever, sometimes I'm asked to look at this stuff. And I remember one of the things I was asked to look at had me taking, well, Sonia Lubomirsky did some software, I mean, so many of the hacking people who've done hacking studies have done software. And you're supposed to take pictures and then put the pictures on a timeline or whatever. So whenever I would test these products, I realized I was totally disengaging from having any experience. Like, I was taking pictures of the birthday party to post, so I was never at the party. And I was recording all of these things, so I was like never present. And I thought, wait a minute, there's really a problem with this. I want to be present, you know, and you know, it could be that we're, you know, that we need to think more cleverly about how to use audio or how to keep a journal that doesn't interfere with these moments that are so magical that we want to record them in some way. But if we're so busy recording them to post, oh my God, that just is terrifying.
I think just building on that, I think one of the values that's considered a virtue today, I think, is multitasking. And I think the problem is...
Which kind? Complex or simple?
I think all kind. Like
Okay.
if you would look at a job description of a person, it's someone who can multitask, work under tight deadlines, is available 24/7. It sounds more like a Pentium chip than a person, right? So it's become that virtue, and I think the challenge is how do we shift that to it not being that virtue, because maybe your body is not designed, as you said, to that continuous partial attention for multitasking. It's designed to be...
Right, well, I don't want to hire someone who's a really good multitasker. I want to hire someone who's really good at setting priorities and being present and doing one thing at a time well. If I interview a multitasker, I send them packing.
Also, think about these. I mean, I'm coming at this from my Zen. Think about some of the experiences that make us feel most alive and most vivid. And they are those experiences where we are focused on one thing. And you've probably heard about those exercises, like Thich Nhat Hanh does this exercise where he gives people a raisin and asks them to eat it mindfully. And sometimes people will say to him, these are really special raisins, where did you get this? You know, because what happens when you slow everything down and you just experience one raisin, it's mind-blowing. The first time I ever ate in silence at a retreat, it was like being stoned. It was like, you know, just the food was so vivid and so amazing. And most of the time I'm eating and I'm reading the paper, and, you know. So I would argue that slowing down and really being able to focus is one of the things that makes us feel most alive. And that multitasking is deadening.
Oh boy, that struck a chord. Someone we haven't heard from before. How about you right here?
I just want to add to maybe some of the other things we should be achieving with technology if we're really to get people to kind of modify their behavior. And I think one thing that's sort of missing is the dopamine response. So, you know, we can see that technology is making us sick in the way it's currently used. But that's because it's so compelling, right? It sucks people in and they get a little hit of dopamine and they want more of that. And so when we create tools, I think we need to create tools that take us out of the immersion, but give us that same hit of dopamine, right? Otherwise, the behavior won't change, right? We know this from addiction, right? Behavior won't change because that what's driving the addiction is underneath the will.
Yes, there's a neurochemical hijacking that's going on in our relationship with technology.
Yeah.
And that is something that, on the one hand, designers can be asked to address it. Companies aren't incented to address that. They're incented to cause you to have the worst behaviors ever. Designers, there's a designer who you might be familiar with, Tristan Harris, who talks about time well spent and is trying to get the technology community rallied around thinking about design differently, that all of the notifications, turn them off. You know, all of those things are aspects of that grand plot to neurochemically hijack you. So you're absolutely right.
Are you guys familiar with the rat park experiments? Because the idea that we're neurochemically hijacked is somewhat problematic because, and the studies are controversial, but they were done in the 80s, and they found that rats are highly social animals.
Yes.
A lot of things we say about
University of
addiction is
Chicago.
based on rat studies. But rats, in this study called Rat Park, were in a kind of heaven for rats, where they had lots of friends, lots of sexual partners, lots of stimulation. Rats are very curious, they love to explore. And they found that they still had access to the cocaine or the methamphetamine that they were administering. And the famous studies involved rats self-stimulating until they starved themselves. This didn't happen in the the rich, socially engaged environment.
Yes.
So there's an issue with even the narrative we tell about that. And so, but I like the point about the goals, because technology in our society is profit focused. So, and even when we say that if we're mindful, we'll be more productive, we're starting to treat ourselves as a product.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes even worse than commodification of happiness.
And treating ourselves as machines.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's one of the anecdotes in Edward T. Hall. I remembered the book in Dimension, so I'm glad you tickled that memory. But that was a great point too, is that the relationships again are sustaining. And so I just want to keep seeding that point is, so if there's an epidemic of loneliness, if we're nourished by relationships, is there a way that the technology can create those meaningful connections or sustain those meaningful connections in a way that doesn't sort of fall into these commodified traps? That's just sort of
We have to have the rat experiment done again with Facebook as the social connector for the one rat. I'm sorry, but.
Wait a minute, I'll jump over here first.
I'm just curious if the replacing dopamine rings true. So if perhaps you get a dopamine hit from something like a notification, is the idea we should give someone an alternative dopamine hit that's healthier? Or with practices in mindfulness, with relationship to mind, body, and that sort of distancing and that sort of health and peace versus always elevated happiness, is it more like we should get away from the dopamine hits and think about something different?
Yeah. That's a really important question, because that is what you were voicing. I can't remember who did it. Was the model that's used to treat addiction, particularly opiate addiction, right? You replace it because the opiate receptors have been hijacked so powerfully that you need something. But these dopamine receptors and the dopamine response is not that addictive. We don't think. We're not sure. But
we don't know.
think. And that retraining is possibly much easier with activities like, so I've been talking with people about socio-emotional learning in schools, and there's a project that the National Health Service in Britain is funding to teach mindfulness to 7,000 kids, because the data is so persuasive that, this is a resource that isn't about dopamine hits at all. It's about calming, focusing, sitting still, and kids love it. And actually the kids who love it the most are the kids with ADD. So yeah.
So you mentioned happiness. I notice when people's face is generating happiness, there's a luminant glow. So I would walk to people and congratulate them on how happy they were, and they had no idea what I was talking about. And it took a couple of years for me to kind of finally get it, that we have a duality to our nature. What a person feels inside of themselves is totally different how their body is projecting. So I'm just kind of curious about comments about that, because this applies to anger. I would say your face looks very angry. I feel very calm. So ultimately, I understood it, and I had to apply it in my own life, because I was working, and one of my coworkers came over and says, "Are you okay?" I was feeling wonderful. I was just like I've never felt so good in my life. So instead of disagreeing, I went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and my face and body looked like I was going to fall apart. Then I lowered my eyes, and I felt really highly energized and happy, and I realized at that moment that my body was so tired that everything in there was jacked up so I could function. So I was experiencing the internal, which is the jacked up state, while the body itself saying, hey guy, I want to go to bed, get some sleep. And it took, like I say, it took a long time to get it, but I finally understand when somebody says something about me, they're talking about my body. They're not talking about my internal experiences. They're just talking about sensations and signals that my body is generating.
My favorite anecdote about this is some of you know Marco Attasari, who started a company here in Boston called Sync Project, and he's a director's fellow at the Media Lab. And I was supposed to visit Finland over the summer, so he said, oh, you're going to really enjoy Finland. And he was joking with me about Finland, and we had been talking about some of the kinds of things you measure, and facial expressions and all this. And he said, you know, you'll never read the face of a Finn. You know, he said the joke is that there's a grid of 16 different facial expressions, but they're all the same facial expression, and you're supposed to match the emotion, anger or happy, and they all look the same. You know?
Their skin tone does change. When you get them to like you, their skin tone becomes alive with sensations. They are afraid of showing their emotions of liking people. But if you get past that point, you see all kinds of sensory feeling, emotions in their skin tone.
I'm a bit curious about like algorithmic affective discrimination. So imagine a scenario where, sorry,
absolutely,
yeah, where an employer maybe is trying to assess the emotional regulation of a prospective candidate, and whether or not that's like, you know, right or wrong ethically. Imagine that the algorithm gets it wrong, and the person isn't able to get a job because they were incorrectly assessed. Do you think this is a kind of issue that we'll see in the attention of the public more and more often?
Well, so I don't know if you heard what he said, but he was talking about algorithmic affective discrimination, which is interesting. I mean, just algorithmic discrimination is interesting and important to care about. And Kathy O'Neill, there's a great TED Talk by Kathy O'Neill that's posted on that. And then I think at the same TED, there was another talk by a guy who's a hedge fund guy, I don't remember his name, who was using crowdsourcing to have people judge each other's decisions and basing hiring and firing on this. I frankly find this to be really hugely concerning. You're talking about affective algorithmic discrimination, which is you're using big data and technology to determine and measure who someone is, but of course the algorithms have bias built into them quite often, and then you've got companies that are making hire and fire decisions. You've got companies handing out Fitbits and monitoring everybody's fitness performance, and if they're doing what they should be doing according to human resources or whoever's making that decision.
Yeah.
These are big areas of concern. I don't know.
Or if it becomes like the norm, you can maybe not really opt out like, socially.
What's your suggestion, since you've thought a lot about this?
Well, I'm curious. I think that maybe we need to have a discussion about the framework for assessing the biases within systems, and then how to deal with them if you know, mistakes are made.
You seem like a smart guy. Can you work on that?
I'm actually working on. I'm trying to develop tools to help neuroscientists do like neural spike train decoding and stuff like that.
So are you building in the
Like
algorithmic? So are you building the affective algorithmic discrimination, or are you helping solve it? Because right now,
I'm just bringing up a related question.
Well, I think it's interesting that you both sort of bring up the same issue of being able. This is a very complex machine, and you know, the perception from a cultural background, from, you know, what you ate that day, how you felt, the guy cut you off like 25 minutes ago.
Your vibration.
The vibration, you know, there's all these ways that what's inside doesn't necessarily resonate with what's outside, and now that we're training machines to recognize these cues, you brought up this research earlier that, you know, the manual this thick didn't lead to necessarily perfect results. And so what does it mean in in an age of AI where increasingly.
It goes back to agency. If we want to give the machines all the power, do you want to live in that world?
Well, on the other hand, I just want to, there is another way in which this is doing wonders, which is that you can give computers tumor cell photos and show them which, and you know the outcomes. So you give them thousands of cases of different cells that are cancerous, not cancerous, more aggressive, less aggressive, and you can teach the computer to recognize cancer better and to stage it better than pathologists. So that's one way in which we want them to,
even just spending more time.
Just spending more time and feeding more data in gets them better and better and better at this. And they can do it, they can improve more quickly than someone who takes 40 years in a career being a pathologist to do the same.
And that's doctor with computer. Is Karthik here? Karthik, are you here? No. Karthik is one of the AI researchers at the Media Lab who's doing a really interesting project with heart disease. One of the things that happens is that physicians, typically cardiologists, recognize heart disease in men and not in women. So Karthik has worked with subject matter experts and has created an AI that's working with doctors and helping them not miss those signs. But it's wise person, helpful technology. It's not a total surrender to technology. So yeah.
Another thing I'll throw out to you guys is, do you have examples of where technology either helps or hinders some of these things we're talking about? If you have something to share, definitely. I know you've been.
I have a question, which is actually directly just follow up to what you just asked, which is, have there been studies on what technologies out there have actually directly contributed to or let people to feel more connected to others? And what are the results? So if there are these technologies, what have they gotten right? What are the commonalities that these technologies have actually helped?
Spell checker.
My sense is actually, I find spell checker really annoying, and I have to turn it off from all my emails. So Linda May probably knows more about this. My sense is that it's really not about particular technologies; it's about how they get used.
Exactly.
And that they can be used for in ways that are more disconnecting, that create more loneliness, more alienation, and they can be used in ways that create more connection. And that it's not about the technology itself.
It's not the what, it's the how.
It's the how.
Yeah. Right. There's a guy who's had his hand up off and on. You.
Well, yeah, there's one we were talking about cameras earlier, but I just wanted everyone too excited about recording things. But if that did come out when the Google Glass, where everyone was going to be recording everybody else all the time, and
how much did we like that?
So, but this algorithmic discrimination I found really interesting from another universe, which is this Black Hat Security Conference over the summer. And one of the talks that was quite interesting was about these AIs. So one of them was you can take a traditional network and you can train it up for image recognition on what's called the 10 classification set, and it's got things like airplanes and trucks and dogs and things like that. And you can train it up and get it to human accuracy, more than a couple nines. And then he systematically went through fuzzing images that no human could tell the difference. They look like the same dog, you'd call it the same name. He's fuzzed the image, so now that trained AI is convinced that dog is a ship. And that is something that the human did to basically attack the knowledge that was already embedded in the AI. So we start thinking about the fuzziness of these algorithms and how do we really understand what they know or think they might know, and just realize that at the end it's a lot of math that can be tricked by us, because the computer was totally convinced those are completely different images, but no human would ever have been able to pick that out.
He wants to respond. Your math guy in the front
So
row.
those are called like an adversarial attack to like a neural network
Exactly.
or something. So you can actually use those to your advantage, even to improve the algorithm itself. One way to do it is to train it on the traditional data and then apply those like perturbations or whatever, change it slightly, and then like continuously improve. Another like technique then you can do, you can use that to help you trace where your algorithm is going wrong by like making like slight errors. So the first example I mentioned, that's called a generative adversarial network, and it looks like really promising like game theory right now.
I'm guessing I've helped Google Maps quite a lot because if it's telling me like if it's a clean break between two routes, I'll go the one it doesn't suggest. If it says to go Starro Drive, I'll go Memorial because it tells everyone to go that way.
Yeah.
Hi. So about half a year ago, I started a meetup group called Wellbeing, and it hasn't been meeting a lot, but it meets in Harvard Square.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. My question is really, there was some really good research done about a year ago between some economists in England and also in right here at MIT, and they were looking at public policy as it relates to well-being. And some of the metrics that they really said shined through was that anxiety and depression had the most significant impact on a person's well-being. And then secondarily, whether they had a partner,